and they engaged they underwent regular baptisms, oblations in these giant, what they call mikvah baths, and big giant bathtubs, basically, where they would step down the steps and immerse themselves and come back up. And by that, they were demonstrating their repentance, and their vision was that when the judgment of God is visited on the temple, and the whole of Jewish society, both Pharisee and Sadducee, goes spinning and goes down the toilet, the Essenes are going to be the guys clinging to the rim. because they weren't associated with that crowd in Jerusalem. And then the Zealots were also a more extreme version of the Pharisees, and the reason why they were extreme was they wanted a revolution. Their vision was, daggone it, we're under the leadership of pagans, and that's an abomination. So we've got to raise up and kick the pagans out. And so these guys were, there were even what were called Sicarii at the time, and the reason they were called Sicarii is because they had daggers, and these guys would basically wander into a crowded place and they would shank Romans, and they were interested in provoking a revolution. It is in all probability Barabbas, the guy that he was the Plan B, and in the crowd, when Jesus is being condemned, and they said, no, give us Barabbas. Well, Barabbas wasn't a bank robber. He wasn't a pickpocket. He wasn't a thief. What he was in all probability, a zealot who had been apprehended as a political prisoner. And so, do we take Jesus or do we take Barabbas? And they wanted Barabbas primarily because the crowd of Jerusalem was at the end pretty invested in getting rid of the Romans, and they wanted a more earthly kingdom and a political uprising, whereas Jesus was in their mind disappointing. Jesus had a revolution in mind too, but Jesus' message was not God, down the Romans. It was that judgment is coming on the people of God first.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One, the Pharisees, would you classify them as reactionary?
Reactionary, yes. Reactionary in the way that basically the narrative, as I've given to you, especially if you're in the Hebrew Bible, the Second Chronicles, is that we fell into idolatry, we went into exile. God miraculously delivered us from exile, and we're never going to go back there again. And so at all costs, we are going to avoid doing anything that takes us back into exile. And the Pharisees were particularly persnickety about saying the way you avoid going into exile is by being super observant to Torah. To be, to the little, the little bits, you tie the tenth of your mince and herbs, and you neglect the weightier matters of the law. This is stuff that Jesus tends to say to the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the guys that, watch Jesus walking through a field and grabbing, grain and popping it in their mouth and gleaning from the field, and they're bummed out because they don't wash their hands. Well, the reason why is all these rituals are prescribed by Torah and the rabbinic tradition that grows up around Torah. And so Jesus and his disciples look like Torah breakers. They look like lawbreakers. And if we get a movement of people like Jesus and his disciples systematically eating and drinking with tax collectors healing people on the Sabbath. Why is that such a big deal? Well, the Pharisees are saying, listen, this is explicitly violating Torah. And these are the kinds of things that get us thrown into exile. And so the Pharisees are trying to shut down Jesus and sort of bark him back into the crowd, into their circle, principally because they don't want to go into exile. And so we're used to reading. You pick up and you go, oh, the Pharisees, they're the self-righteous bad guys. That's because we've been reading a Christian Bible for 2,000 years. If you would have been around in the days of Jesus, man, the Pharisees would have been A, understandable, and B, kind of heroic, because they were like saying, we need to be loyal to God, we need to be devout, we need to be meticulous in our observance of the law. And so when the New Testament sort of breaks out and the Pharisees are the bad guys, they're the ones that are missing God. That's a pretty huge thing, and a scandalous thing for the New Testament to sort of hold out. So yeah, reactionary in the sense that they're looking around them, about like the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party on one hand and the Tea Party crowd on the other hand, look around them and say the whole world's gone nuts and we're the only people that see the light, Yeah.
So would you say Jesus is a combination of a couple of those?
Jesus is noteworthy as another thing entirely. He's observant to Torah. He cares about the law. But notice what Jesus always cares about is the weightier matters of the law. That God doesn't simply want a lot of external law keeping. What God wants is your heart. And Jesus is also about the business of saying that God is not simply interested in the salvation of the Jews from the Gentiles. What Jesus is about the business of is the blessed Israel becoming a blessing to all the families of the earth. So it's not that we're being saved from the Gentiles, but that we are the means by which not only ourselves, but also the Gentiles will participate in the saving work of God. And this openness to the salvation of the nations is the thing that distinguishes Jesus and ultimately the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots all hate this.
I can't remember, was Paul a Pharisee?
Paul would have probably been what would have been a Shammite rabbi. And a Shammite rabbi would have been a particularly conservative version of the Pharisees. He would have been, a tea party of tea partiers. Paul will talk about his own biography as being a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, zealous. Well, that notion that he's zealous for the law was the mark of a Shemite, as opposed to a Israelite rabbi and Pharisee. Yeah. Well, anyway, the point of all this little lesson is that, if you have just, the Hebrew Bible, it's prophet, priests, and kings. You open the New Testament and you say, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, where did all these people come from? And now you go into the book of the Acts of the Apostles, and Paul is exploiting the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees over the question of the resurrection. So here you have two Jewish sects. The Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. They basically think that when you die, worms crawl in, worms crawl out. The worms play pinochle on your snout. That's it. While the Pharisees had this strong belief in a resurrection. And Paul says, you know what? We Christians believe in the resurrection. And by that sort of stoked up this rivalry and used it, to his own advantage. So, well, where does all of this come from? And how would you know what any of this grandiose difference between the two? Well, during this 400 years, a few really, really important things happened. In 333, BC or BCE, depending on the way you see it written in a book, either before Christ or before the Common Era, Alexander the Great came through. Alexander the Macedonian had this grand mission of conquest that took him, out of Macedonia and through the territories that were inhabited by the Greeks, crossed over, into the Holy Land, through Turkey, and ended up at the end of his career all the way out in India. So you have this massive influx of a Greek influence. And the thing that was going on with the Greeks is that they engaged in a process, and I'll put it up here. I'm starting to fill up my board. Hellenization. The Greeks thought that their culture was the best culture. And so wherever the Greeks went, they were rather aggressive in foisting their culture on the lands that they had conquered. So the establishment of Greco-Roman religion was a big thing. Greek language. So that, instead of people speaking indigenous languages, at times this got really, really aggressive. So that, the use of Hebrew, for example, would have been verboten. People were forced to learn Greek. Greek political arrangements, the way, and particularly, even things like little miniature cultural things. The Greeks really thought they were really geeked about the human body, and so things like circumcision were offensive to them because they thought it was to mar and to disfigure the natural human form. And so the Greeks, when they conquered the Holy Land, at times, in particular during the reign of one Greek king, circumcision was absolutely forbidden, and the Greeks innovated a surgical practice to reverse your circumcision, which just, I just can't even imagine. It's one thing to be circumcised when you're an infant. I have no memory of that, but reversing it as an adult. No. Well, anyway, so Alexander goes through, and now, everybody, they're speaking Greek, and there's a rather aggressive movement to establish Greco-Roman religious practice. Now, Greeks, were kind of, worship your own God, no big deal. But you will worship our gods too. This is how it works. And of course, in 99% of the world, this was no big deal. What's another 10 gods? We've already got 100. It's no big deal. Of course, the Jews are pretty disappointed in that because Judaism is known for its rigorous monotheism. And so this periodically caused riots and, really, really awful things. So Alexander comes through. And then, after a while, Alexander's empire, Alexander famously dies out east, and his realm, because he dies without a male successor, cedes to his 4 generals. And his 4 generals got all that territory. And the 2 that become really, really important are the top